Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Thank Edward for his introduction. He's wrong in one respect. I'm not actually an Oxford lawyer, I'm an Oxford historian. The law came after. That may have had some influence over my political career. And it's a great pleasure to follow on from Molly, because I used to say that the years from 2016 through to my departure from Parliament in 2019 were in many ways the most miserable time I've ever experienced. And there were two things, I always say, which stood out from that and were compensation. The first one was that for the first time I worked very closely with members of other political parties. I'd done it a little before, over one or two rebellions that Labour had over some civil liberties issues under Blair and Brown. But essentially I was working very closely with Labour members, Green, Caroline, Lucas, the SNP and Liberals, and Plaid indeed, and got to know some of them personally, on a personal basis, very well. And that was a compensation, because it made one realise in this world of adversarial politics that there is in fact huge areas where people may agree, even though they will have disagreements on other things. And then the second thing was, I got invited a great deal to have lunch in various European embassies. And I have to say their gastronomy was fairly good. Usually they wanted to ask me what on earth was going on, because they didn't know, and I have to say half the time I didn't. Those are the only two compensations for that miserable period of the end of my parliamentary career. And the miserable aspect of it was firstly that I'm sorry I wasn't more successful in trying to prevent what was going to happen post-2016, to try and get the second referendum, to try and get that opportunity for people to reconsider, if they wanted, democratically, the decision that had previously been taken. But because it was so clear to me that what we were doing was so massively harmful to our national interest in every possible respect. And I'm afraid that the years that have followed have simply confirmed for me the extent to which that I was right. Now, I'm a conservative, different from Molly in a way. Conservatives tend to be individuals, and I'm still conservative to my fingertips, really. It's my party that's disappeared somewhere else. As a conservative, I believe in evolutionary politics. I believe in what your forebears have delivered for you, the benefits of tranquil, quiet government, for which one goes and prays if you're an Anglican on a Sunday. We may be godly, believe God out of it if you want, but godly and quietly governed. And here was my political party, to which I'd been a proud member for 40-something years, going completely off the rails in bringing about revolutionary conditions of upheaval, just as Trump is now doing in the United States, with all the misery and fallout that comes from it, setting people against each other, making people angry, raising expectations which are in fact unfulfillable on any rational analysis, holding out promises which can't be fulfilled, and then as it becomes clearer that that is the case, starting, and Molly was quite right to highlight this, starting to short-circuit ordinary democratic and rule of law processes is in a desperate attempt to get themselves out of the mess they themselves had created. So all those arguments over proroguing Parliament unconstitutionally, attacks on the judiciary, dangerous activity, we can see Trump doing it in the United States at the moment, passing legislation in breach of your international legal obligations, and coming up, Conservative Attorney General Suella Braverman, coming out with complete rubbish about what an international legal obligation actually is, and having a Minister of the Crown, who happened also to be a barrister, standing up and saying it doesn't matter, we're only breaking international law in a specific and limited way. These are bad places to be. And have they taken us to this wonderful, buccaneering, swashbuckling future? The global Britain, freed of its regulatory framework from Europe and competing wonderfully on the international stage? Well, of course it hasn't. Because underlying it, even as Trump is going to discover in the United States, despite the US being so enormously larger and more powerful than we are, we live in an interconnected world. And when you start to break the rules-based system to try to suit yourself, unless you're very powerful or very lucky, you are going to find that you are the loser in that process, because quite apart from anything else, you lose trust. And trust is the absolute foundation on which all human relationships are based, including relationships between states as much as anything else. And that's the damage we've done ourselves. I once asked the Foreign Office, how many treaties is the United Kingdom signed up to? Well, the answer came back 13,400. That's only since 1834. The greatest treaty-making power probably in world history, and our forebears did this back in our imperial heyday, because certainty instills the very conditions in which prosperity follows. All that chucked up in the air in the bad belief that somehow it's all going to fall down in exactly the way you want the pile of gold to appear. In fact, there is no gold at all. It's all base metal. So that's our problem. But I do accept, and I'm very strongly of the view, there is no point going into lamentation, because we can't turn the clock back. I can't wave a magic wand and we suddenly rejoin the EU tomorrow morning, even if 99.9% of the British public wanted it, because the EU wouldn't have us back under our original terms of our previous agreement, and the world doesn't work that way. We are where we are. We should start, therefore, by looking at the good things. Despite everything that's happened, despite these really bad years of appallingly poor governance, we still have a robust, fundamentally sound parliamentary democracy, and indeed it showed itself very resilient under the strains. And under the present government, which I don't agree with everything it's doing, I'll come on to that in a moment when it comes to Europe, we actually have, I think, in Keir Starmer, a person who is rooted in that tradition, and I respect him for it, even if I disagree with certain things he may do. So the building blocks are there to start to restore our fortune. How can we best go about it? Well, the first thing is to follow the precept, I think, of Jean Monnet. I am a member of the Institut Jean Monnet in Paris, which was set up in order to promote what Monnet had done. And Monnet is usually remembered for his role in being one of the founding fathers of the EEC. But that's not where he made his reputation. He was a young 26-year-old who was not fit to fight in the First World War, and he turned up in the office of the French president in the middle of 1915 and said, "Mr. President, I don't understand how we are conducting the economics of our war with Germany. We are buying raw materials in competition with the British, and that is pushing up the prices." And the president twigged and appointed Monnet to bang heads together, so there was a common procurement program. In fact, it was instrumental in Britain and France winning the First World War. And he did it again in the Second World War, except that this time after the fall of France, Churchill so respected him, he said, "Don't go back to France," which Monnet didn't want to do anyway, because it was occupied under Vichy. He sent him to the United States to help make sure that procurement was properly carried out. And Monnet always used to say, it takes a crisis to force people to cooperate. Now, we are facing, actually, sorry to be depressing about this, a very serious crisis indeed. The fact that the United States has turned, I'm afraid quite predictably in my view under Trump, into a dangerously unreliable partner, does mean that if we want our values to survive, and not, as Molly so rightly highlighted, being subtly undermined by the trade requirements that the United States is placing on us, or for that matter foreign policy requirements it might place on us, we have got to cooperate with the people who share our values. And the only, obviously there are countries like Canada, Australia and New Zealand that do that, but they're a long way away. It is our closest neighbours, both in terms of economic relationships, but also political relationships and defence relationships, who are absolutely key to our long-term well-being. And we have something to offer them, because despite everything that's gone on, as I know from my time as chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, United Kingdom is still, despite it being very hollowed out at the moment, a capable defence partner, which can be massively enhanced if we are prepared to break down the barriers to cooperation with our European partners. And that can be done if we are prepared to talk to our European partners sensibly about how we can make sure that leaving the EU does not provide an impediment to doing just that. There are ways in which this can be done without reopening at the moment the question of whether we should be in or out of a customs union or a single market. There is in the TCA an Article 770 that actually spells out very clearly how there is the capacity for cooperation on matters of security and defence, and it can be done, but it is going to require some flexibility from our political leaders to achieve it, and also, I have to say, some flexibility on the part of our European partners as well. But we ought to be part and paying into the 150 billion fund that has been set up in the EU for defence procurement. We ought to be part of every single security and defence initiative that they are currently taking. We can do that whilst we are still in NATO. Our participation will be valued. I think the French know that we are an essential partner, because each time they've tried to look elsewhere in Europe to find such a partner, they've been unable to do so, despite their efforts since Brexit. Understandable efforts since Brexit. And this, to my mind, is probably the first pillar of firstly preventing World War III breaking out, because if Putin succeeds in the Ukraine, we are in a very bad place indeed. And secondly, laying the foundations for a new security relationship. Of course that's got to be taken incrementally. I don't criticise for one moment Keir Starmer going over and smooching Trump. It may be unpleasant, but I have to say I don't think there is any other alternative, because to have a sudden and total break of a defence relationship with the United States will leave us at huge risk. So it's probably necessary, but we should look to the future, because the future, it is quite clear that it's only with our European partners that we can build such a security relationship, and it is possible for Europe to do it if it has the will. It's entirely a matter of will as to whether it can be carried out. We have the resources if we are prepared to pool and cooperate together. So that is the first place where I look at the moment to see that revival. Obviously there's talk also about freeing up travel for the and residence for the under 30s. Heaven only knows why we're not doing it. I cannot see how even in the most reform-orientated Labour seat in the north of England there is going to be the slightest conceivable resentment against this. But I will come back to that in just a moment. We can do that. Visa-free things for musicians. There are a whole series of small things, but they are probably more they are useful and symbolic. But this is the single biggest issue on defence, where we have the chance of building this new cooperative relationship. The second thing is about looking at our own public mood. Now, the European movement, some of you will be members, but not necessarily all, started out long before we were in the EEC. It was founded by those very people like Ted Heath and others from all political parties, who, having seen the horror of the Second World War, and also having my father did, so died in the war conservative, a very clear understanding of the fantasies of imperial delusion, and seeing exactly where the United Kingdom's position in the world could be to our best advantage, saw cooperation with Europe as absolutely key to our future. And in its heyday, some of you may not appreciate this, we're talking of over 500,000 members of the EM
back in the 1960s. And it was that which brought about the confidence that remember, Labour and Conservatives were both split over Europe right up to the signing of the treaty in 72, and he only got the bill through Parliament with Labour support. But precisely because it was a broad cross-party movement, it brought all these people together and secured our entry into the EEC. And of course, when we had the referendum, the first thing I ever did in politics was to work for the Keep Britain in Europe campaign. This may explain my fate in post-2016, which is something that stayed registered in my brain. And it coordinated the stay-in referendum campaign and won. And then, of course, it withered away. It turned into a rather elite club of MEPs, forgive me saying it, Molly, and others who were very dedicated to Europe. And I think its membership went down to about 600 people.
Most of them over 80.
Most of them over 80, thank you very much, by the time we got to 2015. And then post-2016, it has revived. I can tell you it's approaching 26,000 members. And it acquired 1,500 members on the day of Trump's inauguration, which I think does say something about people seeing where their butter might best be spread. And it can do, I believe, again, what it did in the 60s, as long as it doesn't turn into a political party, as long as it is welcoming, because even in my former party, I know that there are still people there who know that this has all been a terrible error. If it can continue to be a cross-party and non-partisan movement, I think it has the capacity, particularly if it adds quite a trenchant think tank aspect to its work, which is what we're trying to do at the moment, as well as just campaigning. I think it has the capacity to actually have influence because it is building its branches around the country. And we have to take a long-term view because, as I said, we can't reverse this overnight. It's going to take time. We have to face the fact that Europe is evolving and changing under the pressures it's under all the time as well. So it's not as if it's some fixed point. But if we show the real determination to start, as Molly so rightly said, to start having dialogue and be prepared to disagree with civility, then quite apart from the fact that I think it is going to inevitably take us closer to our European partners progressively and over time, I think it may also improve the quality of our own national political discourse. Because of course I can't escape the fact that one of the worst aspects of what we've done, I'm not pretending it's the sole cause of it, is our politics have become really very angry. And when you look at what's preventing Labour from taking some of the decisions, which I think it should be taking, this fear of reform, the fear of the growth of really, you say right wing, but angry and unhappy people in our country, looking for scapegoats, looking for enemies, stirred up by social media, encouraged by Mr. Musk. I'm afraid the most unfortunate things happened to me in the last year was when I became co-president of the European movement, I was asked to go on X, something I've always avoided. And I don't know how many of you do it, but I do tweet occasionally, but it's a cesspit. And it is a cesspit of real unpleasantness and encouragement to violence, which is having quite a profound impact on our politics. So all those things require people of goodwill to exercise common sense, to come together and discuss problems. And I was pleased to see Molly's bit at the end about possible ways of improving the way our constitution works. I have ideas of my own. I brought out a paper with some others just back before the last election, which government has, about improving standards in government, which can do a lot to reassure people. And to work together and to say quite clearly, the future can only lie. We can't live on our own. Of course, we're friendly on a global basis. We have global ties from our history. But our close neighbourhood is the place that matters. And we expect our government to make sure that those relationships are deepened in our national interest, not for some philosophical, high-flying idea, but simply because, as Monet said, it makes sense. And if we do that, I am confident, despite the fact that one does feel a bit the elephant graph, that depending on where you are on that graph, we're rather low ebb for those of us who feel that way, that in fact, the possibilities of national revival, so that people become optimistic about this country's future and about the huge advantages we have from living here, can once again start to resonate. And if we do that, we will help put our politics back on a proper footing. I have no idea at the moment where they're going, because my former party is still seriously off the rails. But wherever it's going, it will come right for us. And it will do it because we are willing to start looking with sense and kindness towards those around us, and particularly to those who have our own well-being in their own mind. And that certainly applies, in my experience, to those countries of Europe from which we have separated ourselves in leaving the EU. So there's a message which I hope will send you away this evening feeling buoyed up. And we can have some Q&A, because I've probably spoken for quite long enough. And if you think I've tried to avoid any subject, and people usually think that politicians do, you can always raise it with me then. Thank you very much for listening.